Okay, gliding in a team. Your main objective is to get the lowest member of the team at the next climb as high as possible. It doesn't really matter how high the highest person is, it's the lowest person in the team that is the weak link. So you got to get everybody across that transition to the next climb as high as possible. So there's a couple ways to do that. When you're gliding, you need to do it in such a way that you have equal information sharing between all the team members, right? You cannot pimp off each other, right? You have to be setting it up in a way that you have equal access to the information provided. And then you also have to sample the maximum amount of air mass on your way to the next climb. The one thing you want to avoid definitely is going conga line, like front to back, right? Because then you're only sampling one glider's width worth of air. So you definitely have to spread out side by side. Let's just look at it with two gliders. It's kind of the simplest case. How far apart should you be? Well, you have to be able to be close enough so that this pilot can react and take advantage of good air that this pilot finds and vice versa. If you're too far apart, one person could even find a climb, like a straight up thermal, and if you take too long to get over there, you might not be able to find it if you're out in the middle of a valley or if you're not over an obvious trigger point. If you do the math, the narrowest climbs that we can take advantage of are around 30 or 40 meters in diameter. So you should be closer than that, right? You cannot allow a climb to slip in between two gliding pilots. Let's say you don't find actually thermal though, but just one person has a little bit more of a boaty line than the other. So this person starts going up a little, and then what do? This person shifts over, right? They start to come up into that good air, and now you have two pilots in the good air. Well, how do you know that there's still not even better air over this way? So this pilot then shifts again, right? And if they keep going up relative to this person, just rinse and repeat. This person shifts over. Now you're both in the good air. You keep going, keep going. Eventually, you're going to find the edge of that seam, right? And this pilot's going to start dropping out. And then they're going to shift back over, right, into the better air. And then you're going to start sampling the other way. So you're constantly testing the edges of these lifty seams to make sure you're not missing something better. How should we space out front to back, leader and follower, with team gliding to maximize information sharing and make sure that the low person gets across that transition as high as possible? One thing we can do is think about how we fly in comps. We are always looking in front and below us at markers in front of us on glide. And then we're using the information that we see to maximize our own position, to maximize our own altitude. But the markers that we're using, they're not benefiting from any information that we're providing. So that's a one-way street. And the only time you want to use that in team flying is if you have a performance difference in your equipment. So if you have a team member that's flying a much, poor performance glider, it makes sense to let them go behind. Here's the person on the worst glider leaving the climb. As you go across that transition, they're going to be sinking, right? So by the time you get to the next thermal, they're going to be at a pretty similar altitude as the leaders on the higher performance equipment. But if everybody's on equal equipment, you want to be spaced out like side to side as much as possible. You don't want to have somebody way in front and somebody way in the back, because then you have asymmetric information transfer and it's not the best for the team. Now we're topping out our departure climb, and the rule is when the lowest person feels like they have enough, that's when you can go. 4 of us got off together, but you can see Minoru took a couple more turns. You might fault him for that, but if you pause it for a sec, what had happened was he had just started to search out a different part of a core that was opposite from our departure direction, and he actually got a pretty good strike. So right as we were all leaving was when he had gone to sample a different piece of the climb. He wound up a little behind us, but watch what happens after we release all the hounds. In a comp, Minoru there in the rear, his label is partenaire. He could just pimp off us, right? Just sit behind everybody and gobble up the best lines and come in just behind us, but probably higher than everybody. But instead, you'll notice he gets on the bar and he stomps that thing and he catches up, and he's actually right even with the leaders by the time we close on the terrain at Vanguard. So that's a great example of using an altitude advantage to help the group, right? He gets to the front and he participates in the information sharing. Here's a still shot that Anne took about halfway across to Vanguard on that first glide. I don't know about you guys, but when I'm the lowest pilot, I'm not chilling and taking out the camera and snapping some shots. That's Ann for you, man. She's one cool pilot. Take a look at this terrain. I mean, it's just a slope landing, top landing paradise. You can see the snowy peaks on the back spine of the island way out there in the background. And then you can see the sky, it's stable, and there's some Cirrus coming in, which will become a big part of the story later. But you can see the spacing pretty good left to right, and then I would say too far out front in this picture, and I definitely remember feeling exposed in the front, and so coming off the speed bar to slow down a little bit and let folks catch up to me. Back at that clinic, listening to Marcela Uchoa teaching about this stuff, she said, you got to use FOMO to keep the group together. If you're the front pilot, the FOMO, the fear, is getting isolated out front where you can't see the others and you wind up on a bad line and you get lower than everybody. If you're the rear pilot, the FOMO happens when you get afraid of being left behind, right? You're too far back so that when the team finds the climb, you're not able to get into it, and then you're done. That's what keeps everybody moving towards the center of gravity of the middle of the group. I think it's a really nice way of thinking about it. Okay, closing on the terrain here. And it sure is nice to have a bunch of friends with you when you're coming up on a broad spine like this, when there's some wind around. You never know exactly where the climb is going to be. It might be right over the spine, might be a little bit downwind, or there might be just like rippers firing off more upwind than you expect. So you can see how's our spacing here as we bend into the spine. Let's look from above. Yeah, we're still spread out, probably a couple hundred meters at least left to right. As we're getting tighter to the terrain, we have to start deciding what are we going to do if we don't immediately get a climb. But boom, there it is, and the game is on. All right, let's get a first-person feel from Minoru's video cam. So here's Minoru's point of view from his helmet cam in our first climb. It was actually pretty tricky. It was not easy to map out. Felt like we were not in the best part of it. But check out how low Ann is on that orange and white glider down at the bottom. And now a couple minutes later, she's right up in the mix. So awesome. So yeah, with 5 of us mapping it out, we were able to make pretty good progress, but not enough that I felt comfortable to just punt deep towards the peak. So if you look at this trigger that we're climbing off, there's this break in the angle, right, where it goes from steep to a little less steep. I think that's what was triggering the climb that we caught. And then looking up the slope, there's some flat terrain before this next bump where several ridges connect, where we were expecting the next climb to be. And I felt like we didn't have enough height to comfortably go explore that area and arrive over that trigger with enough terrain clearance if there was sync between this climb and that next trigger. So in my mind, I'm planning to recycle this climb. And you can see when we let it run that we were getting blown quite a bit in the wind. And you can see at first it's standing up pretty good, but then it quickly, we're getting slanted there, right? We're getting frisbeed back in the wind. So I'm thinking the obvious move is to push back upwind and find a better piece of the climb. But look at that, boom, JK has gone to go explore this next trigger over here where the cursor is. I didn't feel like I had the margin to pull off that move. I didn't feel comfortable following him. So this moment, the group splits, right? We didn't talk about it beforehand, so we didn't have a shared mental model during this climb. I was thinking the obvious move was one thing. JK was thinking the obvious move was a different thing. And then so then when he made his move, everybody quickly had to decide, hey, are we all going? What's happening? So everybody went with JK right as I had in my head decided, okay, I'm pushing out front. I'm going to recycle, find a stronger climb, and then bench back with more altitude. So we can let it run a little bit and see how it plays out. Minoru followed JK. He actually missed his climb and found a different one back there. And then I did indeed find a much better climb after pushing out front just a little bit. You can see it's standing up tall against the wind. And so now I'm thinking, great, I'm going to zip back there and join those guys. So we can speed it up a bit and see. So for the next few climbs, I was basically one climb behind the group, right? So they're topping out, and I get to the bottom of their climb, and then they've moved on by the time I top out. And I was just in contact. It wasn't like I was getting left behind, but I was feeling kind of ashamed for splitting the group. And during this next climb, where you see Minoru and JK, that area, Marcel got on the radio and said, "Hey guys, let's just hang tight, get in a climb, let's regroup," meaning let's wait for Patrick. As I was playing catch up here, you can see we're moving onto the really good part of the ridge. It turned into a racetrack. So all the spines are now converging onto what on the Sports Track Live has that snow covering on the ridge. We are starting to move fast. So you couldn't sit around in a climb that's only like 2 meters a second here. They're really starting to rip off, and I don't think I would have caught up with the group if they didn't consciously wait for me. Let's jump in and have a look at the Minoru cam. Yeah, this is why we chase it. Running the Harris Range in the middle of the day, and it is firing. Now, how do you keep a group together in conditions like this? Now remember, Marcel kind of put the brakes on everybody, said, "Hey, let's wait for Patrick." How do you actually do that when it's on like this? It seems simple, right? Oh, you just wait at the top of the climb. And there are circumstances where that can work. It needs to be a pretty low wind situation, because if it's super windy, you're going to be frisbeeing along. You can't just sit tight at the top of the lift, right? You're going to be blown out of the thermal. It has to be like a blue day or a day where the climbs are not butting up against cloud base. Because if the top of your climb ends in a cloud, you can't just hang out in the cloud, right? Obviously, you're going to have to leave before you get there. We're looking now at this ripper. Marcel's trying to keep the group together and wait for me. I'm still 200-300 meters underneath him. And at first, the climb's pretty straight up, but look at this now. Let's slow it down. The climb is getting tilted in the wind. Look how much. They're hitting the upper layer and they're starting to get frisbeed there, and that's going to make it a lot harder to stick around and wait for me. But as it turns out, I was starting to lose the climb myself. I couldn't find it anymore. And rather than sit around and poke around and try to find it again when I knew the day was on, I just took off and started heading down the ridge. I figured I wasn't going to make the group wait any longer. So they had good situational awareness, and Marcel and others spotted me, leaving and pushing out. And he made the call, "Hey guys, it's time to go. Let's just follow Patrick." So you can see my track. We had started to get blown quite a bit downwind of the ridge, and when I departed, I made kind of a hard left to get back directly over the ridgeline where I figured the best glide would be. So how do you keep a group of pilots at a similar altitude when you're climbing in a really windy thermal, where you're not going to be able to just hang out at the top of the lift and wait in a stationary spot for the people to join you? So this is a little trickier, but it's totally doable if you have the situational awareness to deal with that separation before you get to the top of the lift. So the move is, once you have mapped out the thermal and it's pretty obvious you know where it's at, and you can see the lower pilot climbing underneath you, it's pretty easy just to push upwind out of the thermal and then rejoin the thermal right at the level of the low pilots. And then that's going to keep everybody at the same level, so that when you do top out in that really slanted, windy thermal, you don't have to try to hang out, right? You're all going to leave together. So here's the group trying to keep it together, waiting for me to catch up. And they're starting to get blown more and more with the wind. So it's harder and harder to stay in the thermal. You'll see there's big holes. You start to fall out the downwind side. You can see me down in the bottom of the screen a couple times, way down there. But they're doing a great job, keeping it together in pretty rowdy, pretty active conditions. And then a little later in the clip, here we can see there's almost no lift anymore. They're just coring zeros, just trying to wait for me and see what I'm doing. And then when they see I'm leaving, Marcel made the call, and boom, they all leave the thermal within 1 360. So that was really clean. So you can see their climb at the top is really windy. They're just hanging out in zeros. I make my move, and boom, 1, 2, 3, 4 of them in pursuit. And take a look down course line.
Yeah, not a mystery on where we're going, right? We're just jamming down this ridge. And in hindsight, I could have used a little less bar. It was a crosswind glide. I was using about half bar. I should have just gone on to trim because it took them a while to catch up to me. JK and Minoru were pushing the most bar, and they did eventually pull up pretty close to me before we got the next climb. But there's basically no chance of Ann being able to get on enough bar to catch me. So that was a mistake on my part. We can speed it up a little bit to the next climb. So this is just the speed run section of the day. There you go. And you can see we both found climbs, me and Minoru, and then his turned better, so I went over to join him. But it was also pretty windy though. Look how much it got drifted. The next thing of interest is if you look at this little spur that we're over now that's kind of pointing towards this feature. Let's pause it. This feature, I'm going to highlight it with a cursor over here. That's Rose's Saddle, and that basically divides the drainages from the Wanaka side to the Queenstown side. So if you bomb out on the north of Rose's Saddle, you're walking to Glendew Bay. If you bomb out on the south of Rose's Saddle, you're walking out towards Queenstown, and it's a bunch of hours either direction. I made a mistake here. I thought we were going to push out this spur and then head towards this side of Rose's Saddle. And I got a little ahead of my skis here. And you can see my track there. It took a hard left turn. If we back it up a little bit, you can see where that happens. I'm in the front. I think in my mind everybody's going to run down this spur. So I go that way, and then I didn't see anybody following me. I got on the radio, and there's a little bit of confusion. So FOMO took over. I didn't want to get isolated in front, so I just turned around and joined the group. So let's take a look at what that glide looked like from the Ann cam.
So a couple things. Great separation on glide, Ann and Marcel. And then number two, if you look off in the distance to the northwest, see how it looks real dark over there? Yeah, the sky is starting to close in a little bit, and there's some shade advancing on us. Bum, bum, bum. That's it for part 2. You can't get off the train now. Coming up next, part 3. Team flying, search, discipline.